Geekonomy, the 24th of July, I'll start in English and then I'll switch to Hebrew, and then the episode itself would be in English as well. אז הפרק הזה הוא עם פרופסור יוג'ין קונטורוביץ, הוא מומחה למשפט בינלאומי, הוא למד באוניברסיטת ג'ורג' מייסון ומלמד משפט בינלאומי, וכן, הוא גם מפורום קהלת שחצי מעם ישראל כרגע ממש כועס עליהם, החצי השני לא יודע מה דעתו עליהם כרגע, אבל לא התייחסנו לנושאים האלה. אם אתם מחפשים ריב ומדון והאשמות על פורום קהלת, זה לא המקום. הזמנתי אותו כי הוא בן אדם מאוד מאוד רהוט, שמכיר את החוק הבינלאומי, מכיר כל מיני נושאים שקשורים לבית המשפט הבינלאומי ולכל העניינים הרלוונטיים לשם בגלל התביעה נגד ישראל, ואותי אישית זה עניין. ואם הבן אדם מבין בזה, אז אני לא הולך להיות אפולוגטי. הזמנתי אותו כי הוא מומחה בזה, ואם זה מאוד מפריע לכם, אז תקפצו על הפרק הזה, תאזינו לפרק הבא, או תשמעו את הפרקים הקודמים. היה לי מאוד מאוד מעניין לדבר איתו, הוא רהוט, הוא מעניין, הוא לא הכניס יותר מדי את הדעה האישית שלו. כן, ברור שכל השיחה צבועה מהצד הפוליטי של יוג'ין, אבל עם כל הכבוד לא נראה לי שתוכלו למצוא יותר מדי חורים במה שהוא אמר, ואם כן תמצאו, תכתבו לי. אני אשמח להחכים, כי כן מאוד החכמתי מהרבה דברים שהוא אמר שאני אישית לא הכרתי, אז ניסיתי לא להפריע לו ופשוט לשמוע ממנו על כל הנושאים האלה, שהוא ידע להסביר אותם בצורה מאוד מאוד מעניינת. אני גם אמיץ לכם, אם אתם רוצים לשמוע עוד מיוג'ין, הוא הקליט פרק עם רס רוברטס, אדיר, אחד הפודקאסטרים הראשונים שגם מתארח בגיקונומי, והם הקליטו ביחד פרק לאחרונה, אז אני אשאיר לכם את הלינק לפודקאסט של רס עם יוג'ין, ומשם נכנסו יותר לעניינים של הגדה המערבית, של יהודה ושומרון, וכל מיני נושאים שקשורים שם. אז זהו, היה לי מאוד מאוד מעניין, ולפני שנגיע לפרק הזה, אני אספר לכם על נותני החסות שלנו, והפעם זו חברה שמייצרת את אחד מהמוצרים האהובים עליי כרגע בארץ, חברת לוין. אני הולך הרבה ברגל, אם אתם רואים אותי ברחבי תל אביב או לא יודע איפה, אתם תראו אותי הרבה פעמים הולך ממקום למקום, מפגישה או עושה פגישות בהליכה, והסיבה היחידה שאני יכול לעשות את זה, תצחקו, זה כי מצאתי תחתונים וחולצות שמתאימים לי למזג האוויר הישראלי, וזה המוצרים שחברת לוין הישראלית מייצרת. סופר רלוונטי לקיץ הבלתי נגמר באמת מאתגר הזה שיש פה. היא מייצרת פה בתל אביב חולצות ובוקסרים לגברים שמותאמים לחלוטין למזג האוויר הישראלי, בלי להתפשר על איך שזה נראה על הגוף. זה די מפתיע כשלובשים בפעם הראשונה בוקסרים או חולצות מהחומרים האלה ושנעשים בצורה הזו, מבמבוק וכל החומרים שהם משתמשים בהם. זה פשוט משהו אחר, תאמינו לי או לא, זה באמת משהו אחר. זו לא רק כאמור הגזרה או הסטייל, זה פשוט מרגיש אחרת לגמרי ובצורה הרבה יותר נעימה על הגוף. זה נוח, נושם, אוורירי, אנטי-בקטריאלי, כלומר עמיד לפני חיידקים ובקטריות. זה גם נראה יותר טוב שזה יוצא מהכביסה, למען האמת. אני רק צריך לגייס את זה מעט ובום, זה מוכן, וזה פשוט מרגיש שונה מחולצות טישרט פשוטות אחרות. בקיצור, זה בול בשביל המקום הזה, והעונה הזו, בד במבוק שמשלב נוחות, פחות לחות, פחות בקטריות, מגן מהשמש, מעודד קיימות, ומיוצר פה באזור שלנו, אז לי אישית זה מאוד מאוד חשוב, ויש גם הטבה מיוחדת למאזיני גיקונומי, קופון של 25% הנחה על כל המוצרים באתר, יהודי כאמור רק למאזיני גיקונומי. פשוט תכניסו את הקופון גיק 25 ותקבלו 25% הנחה לרכישה של כל המוצרים באתר. Geekonomy, the 24th of July, and this evening I have the pleasure of talking with Eugene Kondrovic. Yeah, I didn't say that correctly.
Kondorovic.
There you go, Professor Kondorovic from George Mason University and Kehlet. And anything else I forgot?
No, that's it.
Okay, and we are going to talk about international law and the predicament that Israel is in right now. But before we start, can you please explain to me, as a complete idiot in law, what exactly is an international law?
So it's a good question, and I should tell you that when I teach international law at law school, we spend 3 weeks maybe on the subject, what is international law, does it exist? But basically, international law are the rules that govern primarily the relationships between countries. They are the rules for countries. Historically, it has dealt almost exclusively with the relationships between countries. Now, a lot of international law, such as human rights law, tries to address the relationship between countries and their own citizens, but basically it is rules created by countries that apply between countries. So the kind of law we're familiar with applies from the country down to people, and this is the rules that try to apply between countries.
What's the legal grounds for an international law to be even prosecuted?
To be created, how are they created? So,
for instance, or to be judged upon?
So those are two different questions, because there's many rules which are never judged.
For instance?
Even in domestic law. Most laws never get a hearing. Most contracts are not really enforceable. That is to say, the value of suing on them is greater. It will cost more to sue on them than the value of the contract. They're designed to help navigate. They're designed to help navigate relationships. But the question is, who makes international law? Because for a law to exist, there has to be some superior force. Domestically, it's a sovereign. But what is above countries? So it used to be, the idea was God was above countries, and so the international law tradition was based very much on natural law. And this was very much the case during the period of the ascendancy of the Catholic Church in Europe. But since the Reformation, and certainly since the Enlightenment, the idea is, well, we're not going to say God is on top. So if there's no God, what is there? Nothing. And so the countries are the top level deciders, which means you can only have a country can only be bound by a rule of international law if it has agreed to the rule.
So all of these treaties that we hear about, if a country signs on one of those treaties, it's applicable to be judged upon?
So judged is a whole separate question. It is binding in some sense.
In what sense?
For example, in the sense of shaping expectations. The other countries, for example, there are rules that determine games that children play. Most of these rules, if you break the rules when you're playing games amongst children, you're not going to be taken to court. Rather, the children will generally know not to play with you. So just like the countries make the rules, they're the primary enforcers of the rules. Now, they're not necessarily going to enforce them much, right? There's a big problem of enforcement. But to the extent there is enforcement, the primary form is by other countries, which is why international law works best when it's reciprocal. That is to say, countries make deals between each other. So when countries, let's say, classic form of international law, diplomatic relations. I promise not to abuse your ambassadors when they're here, and you promise to also respect my ambassadors. So if one country A kicks out the ambassadors of country B, it's very easy for country B to take action. They kick out the ambassadors of country A.
I'm sorry, but I need to be rude here. If it's so vague, what exactly are you teaching? What exactly are you researching as an expert in international law? And you're not the only one. So I must assume there's a lot to research, there's a lot to debate. And if it's so vague, it's only like, So what are the merits of international law?
In law, the vaguer something is, the more there is to debate, and the more positions you can take. You can know when a rule is very clear. There's not going to be any cases. Right? Mm-hmm. Disputes are a result of unclear law. So I'm not here to sell international law. And there are some people who, if they research or teach international law, they think international law is great and they want more of it. International law is neither great nor bad. It is what it is, which is a useful instrument to navigate certain kinds of relationships between countries, and less useful for other kinds. There are many kinds of relationships in which it's quite useful. Let's say diplomatic relations, extradition, in trade relationships like the World Trade Organization, investor-state dispute resolution, lots of areas. But generally, the areas that are most known to the public, the law of war, Geneva Conventions, things like this, the more high stakes, the less likely international law is to work.
So, for instance, in Geneva, I think the majority of us at least heard about the committee, the treaty, and the convention, and we know when a specific country, be it Israel, Russia, Europe, the States, whoever, we know when they're supposedly breaking the rules of the committee. What's about it? What can someone do when you identify a country breaking the law?
So again, the Geneva Conventions is a more modern kind of treaty, because it is not based entirely on reciprocity. That is to say, there are certain provisions of the Geneva Convention that a country has to respect, even if the other country is not respecting it, or sometimes even in cases where the opposing side is not a country, but a guerrilla force. But mostly these things are designed to be self-executing, which means they work much better for Western democracies. So, for example, many countries, America, Britain, Israel, if members of their armed forces commit violations of the Geneva Conventions, they will prosecute them. And in fact, this happens not irregularly.
Wait. And in the court of law, inside of those countries, they're not trialed by the Geneva Convention. They're trialed based on
the Geneva
local laws.
The Geneva Convention actually depends and assumes there's no special international court for the Geneva Convention. The International Criminal Court has tried to be that, but originally in the Geneva Conventions, it is designed for each country to enforce upon itself. Now, additionally, who else can enforce it? Typically, let's say war crimes are committed by one power in a two-side conflict.
Yeah, like from Serbia, people from Serbia that were tried.
So there are two possibilities for who's going to punish them. Either their own side, which can happen, happens much more with Western democracies, or also the other side. Right. So, for example, take World War II as an example everybody's familiar with. It's before the Geneva Conventions, but there were other rules of international law. The victorious powers tried the defeated power for violation of international law.
So Nuremberg law, the Nuremberg trials, I guess the majority of us have heard about them. What was the legal or ethical basis for the Nuremberg trials? So what kind of a law codex or just a written law was the basis for the Nuremberg trials?
So the Allies, they made up a new body of law called the Nuremberg Charter, which defined a series of crimes. Many of these crimes already existed in international law. Some of them were newer, like aggressive war. So they created some new crimes, and their basis for having authority to do so was they were the government. Right? That is to say, they had power to try, for example, German citizens, because they were the government of Germany.
Like an official occupation of the German lands from one side.
Germany had given all of its power through an unconditional surrender, and so now they had the power to punish. Now, there's a question, because some of the things were actually legal. The big question with Nuremberg is some of the things were legal, maybe perhaps at the time, under German law. So that gets into a big dispute. But again, the principal enforcement is typically by... the Nuremberg was criticized as victor's justice.
By who?
Oh, lots of philosophers.
No, really. By who?
Really? Everybody.
Is it like a famous thing in your line of work?
It's something that the judges were themselves aware of, and they tried to avoid. They tried to make it clear that these were pre-existing offenses, but that was a big concern. Because very famously, and people pointed out at the time, the Soviet judges, the Soviet Union was in the prosecution, and the judges. But they were not being tried themselves for the Katyn Forest massacre or other...
Or the battle in Berlin, where a lot of foul play was...
There is no such thing as loser's justice. There's just no such thing. Right? And neither the ICC, no new invention can create loser's justice, because to exercise legal authority, one needs power.
Yeah, you need a monopoly on power, or at least enough power to impose.
And to jump forward maybe to a topic, but this is a very good example currently. So the ICC has indicted some Hamas leaders and some Israeli leaders. Now, leaving aside the merits of whether the court has jurisdiction or whether the relevant crimes have occurred, there's an inherent problem here for Western democracies. So the ICC says, look, we're doing both sides. It's very fair.
Can you say a few words about the ICC? What is the ICC?
Yeah, let me just finish this thought.
I'm sorry. Okay. We'll get back to it. Okay.
I'll say the ICC is a freestanding international court. That is to say, it's not part of the United Nations. It's not part of any body. It's created by a treaty that is designed to create this court. And again, based on the rule of international law, that only countries can bind themselves. You can't make rules for other countries. It only has jurisdiction, generally speaking, over the countries that have agreed to join it, of which Israel is not one, and that's one of the big objections. Many countries have joined, over 100, but it still remains the case that most of the population of the world lives in countries that have not joined the ICC, and most countries that are likely to be repeatedly using military force have also not joined the ICC. So, for example, India, Pakistan, China, the United States, Russia, all Arab countries except Jordan, I believe. So it's basically a court that's created mostly by countries not likely to have need of it as a kind of ideological thing. And again, I think your listeners might have some conception. International Criminal Court, they hear like cases every day. They're doing justice constantly. In their 22, 23 years of existence, with a budget of several $100 million a year.
A year?
International anything.
How do you spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year if I saw that like, in Wikipedia that only like 23 or 24 people were indicted in that court?
Indicted. How many people have been convicted finally after all the appeals?
4?
4.
Yeah.
4 of mass atrocities. Yeah. Again, tellingly, they have convicted 6 people, more people than they've actually convicted of war crimes, genocide, etc., of secondary crimes, obstructing justice, non-cooperation, contempt of court, things like this. So 4 people have been convicted finally of atrocity crimes. And again, but back to the point I was making earlier, how is international law enforced? Not surprisingly, far more than 4 people of the ones that have been indicted have died violently prior to making it to The Hague, because that's part of the situation they were in. And, just for example, maybe 2 weeks ago, Mohammed Dif, the ICC can now cross one of the lines out of its docket because he was one of the people indicted by the ICC. They don't have to worry about that warrant anymore.
Hopefully.
Yeah, because Israel seems to have taken care of it. That is the typical way of taking care of it. But back to this point. So let's say that you are a terrorist leader, dictator like Putin, authoritarian leader with some degree of absolute undemocratic power, and you're about to start a war or commit an atrocity. Invade Ukraine, invade some other country, kidnap some school children in Africa, a rebel group. Okay, so what's your decision tree look like? Your payoff matrix. Huh? So there's 2 possible states of the world. You could win, succeed, and stay in power. Then, despite your atrocities, you're going to be called chief, and you will be a big man.
And we can see Assad welcomed back to the family of Arab countries.
Assad's a perfect example. So win, he stays in power, and by definition, no one is going to hand him over because he's in power.
You won.
Lose. What if you lose? Then
Gaddafi. Saddam Hussein.
Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. You will find
Mubarak.
And so you will meet a violent and unpleasant death. Maybe the very best case situation, Bashir, the dictator of Sudan, who was indicted by the ICC, couped by his own generals. Those things rarely end pleasantly. So there's two states of the world. Now, if you fall from power, then the ICC becomes a possibility. But in this case, the ICC actually makes you better off. Because, right, if you fall from power, there used to be one outcome. You end up with your head on a stick, like Gaddafi. Now there's maybe a second outcome. Maybe somehow the ICC is going to convince the people who take you from power that they have to hand them over. In which case, 14 years, which I think is the average prison sentence for all atrocity crimes in the ICC, 14 years in The Hague is much better than any alternative that you could imagine. So, in fact, it actually increases their payoff in the bad state of the world and doesn't change it at all in the good state of the world.
Yeah, I think I can think about one example of a contrary fact where Milosevic from Serbia, where Serbia is still the same country, basically. They just failed to unify Yugoslavia again. So they didn't lose miserably, but they didn't win completely, and he was tried.
Yeah, and that was a much better outcome for him than if he wound up and he was tried but never convicted, by the way.
What do you mean?
He died before. Okay. So and which often happens. These people are often old, and the proceedings are very, very slow. So that's very, very common. So the ICC actually makes you better off, right? Gaddafi would have loved to be given over to the ICC. Would have begged for it.
How can a leader of a democracy can be tried if, under the basic assumption, he basically does what the people placed him to do?
So we just looked at the incentives for the dictators.
Yeah, okay.
Now let's look at the incentives for a democratic leader. Democratic leaders rotate out of power. Right? Even Netanyahu at some point will not be in power.
He lost already a few times.
Gallant will not be in power.
Most likely.
So for them, the benefits are much smaller, right? They're not like having billions of dollars in their bank accounts like Sinwar. They're not internalizing as much of the benefit. They're internalizing a small part of the benefit and can expect in the natural course of things that they will not be in power. So for them, even if the charges are completely meritless, the very prospect of having to deal with it is going to discourage them to vigorously pursue the war, because they will then bear disproportionate risk. Now, of course, Netanyahu, Gallant, they've said all the right things, that they're not going to be deterred, they're going to ignore it because the soldiers take even greater risks. But let's say, lower level officials might be deterred. So already you've created a situation where you're actually improving the outcomes of the dictators and terrorists while deterring democratic leaders. So how can democratic leaders be tried? I mean, they can be tried if their country agreed to it. That's fine. But there's a fundamental rule of the ICC, complementarity, which says the ICC only intervenes and investigates if the domestic legal system is incapable or unwilling of investigating the relevant crimes. Now, of course, to determine whether it's capable or not, you have to make an independent determination whether there is, in fact, underlying crimes to be investigated. That is to say, the domestic legal system is not expected to investigate just for the sake of investigating. Right? The way the ICC has currently interpreted it, they say, look, Israel is not investigating Netanyahu for starvation. Now, that could be because the Prokuratur doesn't think there's actual starvation, because numerous papers have shown that Gazans get 3,000-something calories, a lot more than you need, and a lot more than most people get. So if there's no starvation, what would a normal functioning legal system do? Not investigate anybody for it. Right? The way complementarity was supposed to work is it's a more general test of, does the country have a legal system that generally, if they believe there's a crime, they would investigate?
Yeah, I would say that I personally don't know. I try to investigate as a private person just for my own, just to satisfy my own intellectual pursuit of knowledge. So I found the claim of 34 Gazans dying because of starvation. I saw a lot of pictures of very thin kids. Of course, as a father, something that can really upset me. But I don't have any way to determine here or there.
So there is a claim that 34 people in Gaza have died of malnutrition, but the I forget the abbreviation for it, the F something C. It's a UN-related food safety agency, which is the agency that has been warning of starvation in Gaza. A month ago, 6 weeks ago, shortly after the ICC released their call for an arrest warrant, this UN agency made a revision of their previous assessments. They said, we were wrong. There is, in fact, no famine.
Because previously they claimed that tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands are at risk of starvation. Yes. But just to be fair, at that point, the number of aid trucks going into Gaza went up sharply, right?
They revised actually their numbers because they first of all, the previous numbers didn't include lots of trucks. They were only counting UN trucks, not private trucks. The claim of 34 people starving is based on a survey. That is to say, they would call up Palestinians and say, do you know anyone who's starved to death? So that's not a really great methodology for determining whether someone has in fact starved. But currently, the estimate of calories into Gaza is 3,000-something calories a day, which is about 50% more than is needed. And here's the crucial point. Whether anyone has starved in Gaza or not is a very separate question from whether Israel has starved them, for two reasons.
And specifically Netanyahu as a decision maker.
Or specific, or whether Israeli government policy. Because we know there has always been adequate food going into Gaza. Once the food gets to Gaza, distribution is a whole separate issue. We also know that Hamas criminal elements steal food. So Israel is not occupying Gaza. Israel is not responsible for feeding the population of Gaza. And thus, whether food gets to Gazans or not is an entirely separate question. That is to say, it's possible Hamas starved 34 people to death.
What's the legal definition of an occupation in that aspect?
But let me say one other thing.
Yeah.
But also, it is actually under international law, and this is the most shocking thing about the ICC, it is permissible to deny food into an area. It is not only permissible, it is a standard military tactic. And what's shocking about the ICC is they, basically pretend that this does not exist. It's a tactic called siege. And according to the U.S. Defense Department Law of War Manual, siege is an ordinary, legitimate part of military operations. What we're doing, sending trucks into Gaza, is not how most wars work.
Usually across the times or the years, siege did not operate that way. The siege on St. Petersburg was completely different.
Or take the siege of Mosul, the siege of Sinjar, the siege of Fallujah, recent sieges.
Okay.
So under the law of siege, as it currently stands, under the Geneva Conventions, forget World War II, according to the U.S. Defense Department Law of War Manual, which states it quite clearly, siege is a legitimate tactic, and siege is when you basically cut off supplies to your enemy. There's an area where your enemy is, and you want to deny him supplies. You are allowed to cut off the supplies so long as your purpose, your intention, is to cut off to the enemy force. Then you can do it even if civilians will also not get supplies. So that is to say, we're talking about a situation, a city, there's a military force there and there's civilians, you can besiege the city, even though there are also civilians there. You cannot besiege purely civilians. But of course, we know that,
it's mixed, as in Mosul, as in Gaza. But you mentioned...
But let me say one more thing. There is an exception, a very narrow exception, that food has to be provided for people under 15, or 15 and under, and for maternity cases. That is a very narrow exception, and much narrower than the amount of food Israel is in fact permitting in. But there's even an exception to the exception. If there is any belief, credible belief, that the supplies being sent in are being diverted and not going to civilian use, it can be shut down completely.
Okay, so two questions. One is the legal definition of an occupation. And you mentioned that Israel is not occupying right now Gaza, and I want to understand what is the meaning of an occupation in that aspect. That's one question. And the other is, you mentioned the U.S. as one aspect of the international law, but at least from what I know, the U.S. is also did not sign on the committee for the ICC, right?
Yes, but the Geneva Conventions, which is where the rules on siege come from, are separate and prior to the ICC. They exist independently. I would give you another example. The UK military manual, Law of War Manual, actually says siege is often a more humane alternative and is a nicer, kinder, gentler way of fighting wars because you cut off supplies and eventually the enemy will surrender rather than having to go in and have an urban conflict which can result in very high casualties. Now, I think the anticipation was an enemy that cares about
human life,
their own citizens. Right, and I think in this case, by the way, Hamas is
clearly does not.
No, not only clearly does not, but is in many ways worse than many of the bad actors that we have seen. Yeah, more like ISIS and less like Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, which we think is the paragon of evil, they were very evil to us, but they saw German civilian casualties as a very bad thing and sought to minimize them. So, for example, they wore uniforms, so that you would shoot the German soldiers and not the German civilians. So Hamas has found a way to be... The Nazi Germany was very bad because they didn't care about their enemies. Hamas has taken it to the next level by neither caring about their enemy civilians nor their own civilians.
It's even more extreme than that, where they have a strong incentive for harsh pictures and large number or increased number of casualties on their side. But let's get back
occupation. You want to know what an occupation is?
Yeah, what's the definition of an occupation?
So there's a pretty clear definition of occupation. It comes from the Geneva Conventions, before in the Hague Conventions. An occupation is when you have a war between two countries. So that's one necessary aspect. You can't have occupation, for example, in a civil war. You need a war with two countries. One country, the armed forces, takes over a territory belonging to the other side and doesn't just have like battlefield control, but rather begins to actually administer the government. I think the easiest way to picture it, they come into the city hall and they kick out the former people and they put in their own people and begin to administer the government. So that is an occupation. When they exercise, and the definition is basically actual control. When the other army exercises actual control over daily governance.
היי חבר'ה, ניקח הפסקה קטנה מהפרק הזה ואני אספר לכם שוב שנותני החסות שלנו זה חברת לוין שמייצרים פה בתל אביב חולצות ובוקסרים לגברים שמותאמים למזג אוויר הישראלי. מהרגע שאני התחלתי ללבוש את זה, זה שינה לי לגמרי, לא יכלתי לחזור אחורה, אני עכשיו רק עם החולצות והתחתונים האלו. כן, זה צריך לקחת בחשבון שזה יותר יקר, אבל אם אתם כמוני הולכים המון ברגל וזזים ממקום למקום, בלחות ובחום פה, בטח בגוש דן, אני באמת לא יכול לחזור אחורה, זה מיוצר מבד במבוק טבעי, ופה, מיוצר פה בארץ, זה נוח יותר, נושם אוורירי, אנטי-בקטריאלי, מגן מהשמש, כל מה שאתם צריכים בשביל המזג אוויר המאתגר פה בישראל, וזה גם נראה טוב, זה חולצות שנראות טוב, ויש קוד הנחה מיוחד למאזיני גיקונומי, קופון של 25% הנחה על כל המוצרים באתר, ייעודי כאמור למאזיני גיקונומי, פשוט תכניסו את הקופון GEEK25, ותקבלו 25% הנחה לרכישה של כל המוצרים באתר. ועכשיו בחזרה לפרק, מקווה שמעניין לכם.
So that is the definition of occupation.
So because Gaza was never part officially of Egypt, so it is between 48 and 67, when the West Bank was officially part of Jordan, Gaza was not officially part of Egypt, so there's no merit for the claim of an occupation?
No, well, there's no merit for several reasons. First of all, on the narrowest reason, Israel's not administering the government there, right? That's the kind of day after scenario. Israel's taking great efforts to not administer the government. Israel is not running the show. They're not an occupying power can do all sorts of things. They can requisition people for work. They can take things. Right? They're in a sense running the show. So Israel is not trying to run the show internally in Gaza.
Although one can claim we do supply water, we do supply electricity.
No, that we're doing because we're told we have to. That's not.
But we still do it.
No, but we're not responsible for the distribution. For example, supplying is different. That's a humanitarian provision. In a siege, you can supply humanitarian goods. It doesn't mean you're occupying it. A siege is different from an occupation. So in the narrowest sense, we're just not running the show there. In the way that we are, for example, in Yehuda v'Shimron. But in a broader sense, I don't think Gaza could be occupied because it is not a country. Forget what it was 48, 67. Today, it is not a country. So it is not an international armed conflict, and thus the occupation simply cannot apply.
So if, for instance, Spain, Belgium, Norway, whoever acknowledges Gaza as the 197th country or something like that, what's the difference after that happens?
Well, then if they were to occupy Gaza, it would be an occupation
because they acknowledge them as a country.
Yeah, from their perspective, but their perspective is not binding on us.
The 196 or 4 or whatever, the South Sudan is like the last one. So all of the countries before South Sudan, everybody else acknowledges them?
Not every country acknowledges every other country.
Because we have cases like Taiwan and other countries.
North Korea, South Korea.
Okay. So what's the international law says about that situation?
So recognition by one country of another is a purely political, optional decision. The test of whether a country is like an objective test. It's theoretical. You can be a country and not be widely recognized. Probably if nobody recognizes you, it would be hard to be called a country. Part of the objective test is capacity for foreign relations. But there are entities that look a lot like countries that don't have much recognition, like Somaliland, for example, though Somaliland has recently been recognized by a few countries.
Yeah.
And then there are entities...
Not a lot. Just if you're hearing it and you have like the false impression of tens of countries that are
but
acknowledging Somalia.
it went from 0 to I think 3, so it's a big change.
Yeah, but it's still the same number 3 as I just mentioned, like Norway, Spain, and Belgium for Gaza or whatever. It's still a very small number.
I'm giving Somaliland as an example of something that actually functions in many ways with a country. Its main lack is this international recognition. On the other hand, there are things that don't function like a country.
Catalonia, Palestine,
and have broad recognition. But recognition is not what makes something a country. ISIS would not be a country if, tomorrow lots of countries recognize it.
So if, for instance, there was a trial in the ICC, one of the clauses in the defense for Israel would be, we are sorry, this is not a country?
Indeed. Well, that's for an even more fundamental reason. The ICC can only have jurisdiction over countries that have joined it. Israel has not joined. So the whole argument for how is ICC issuing warrants against Israelis, they say, Palestine joined. So we say, but Palestine's not a country. They say, it's a country for the purposes of the ICC. By the way, they're not even claiming it's really a country. They're claiming, actually, that the word country, state, actually, in the ICC treaty, might mean something different from the word state in other places.
And what do you base? Like, if you're coming to the courtroom and you need to prepare and you're coming with precedents and, I don't know.
They're not so interested in precedents, I think. I'll tell you. Much of this is driven... So, okay, let's go back to the beginning of our discussion. You said, where does international law come from? There's not a lot of material. That's true. I mean, in some areas. So I want to say there's many different areas of international law.
Yeah, when it comes to economical laws, there's a lot.
International, you could read WTO dispute resolution decisions all day. But in terms of the laws of war and other things people might care about, international law is thinner because there's also no courts of general jurisdiction. So it's not like Bagatz with 12,000 cases a year. There's...
How many?
12,000 petitions that they accept.
Okay.
They don't write a full opinion in each one.
Okay.
It's thin, right? This frustrates many international law professors because they want to have more stuff. So there's a tendency amongst people who practice international law to promote things which are not really legal materials to a legal status to have more to work with. And biggest example of that is treating General Assembly resolutions as if they have legal value. Now, they do not have legal value. How do we know? Because the UN Charter, which creates the General Assembly, does not give any lawmaking, rule-making power to the United Nations General Assembly. But there's a tendency to go with the flow. So the ICC, why did it decide that Palestine is a country? They said the United Nations General Assembly said it was a country.
But it's not the 195th country.
But they called it a country, which is also not completely true. They said we recognize the state of Palestine, so there should be a state of Palestine. It was kind of one of, because it's this paradox, right? They say there's a Palestinian state, so there should be a two-state solution.
But it's like René Descartes. I'm here because I think.
Right, if there's a Palestinian state, then there is a two-state solution. So they said they said Israel should allow the creation of a Palestinian state.
Because according to the resolution by the same UN that you just mentioned from 1947, there's supposed to be...
No.
No, it's not related?
Unrelated. But we should address that because that's a common misconception. There's a street in Jerusalem named after that misconception. But the reason it's a problem is the General Assembly is a political body. That's not a criticism. That's just what it is. That's what it's supposed to be. It's not a criticism of the Knesset that it's a political body. Right? They're there to reflect the
difference
views.
Is it's not right or wrong, it's the majority's call.
Yes, and that is how the General Assembly works, right? It represents the political views of the countries, the majority of countries, which are generally unattractive dictatorships. But when the ICC uses the General Assembly to establish legal facts, it is abdicating its duty. It's supposed to be an independent court. It is supposed to independently determine. Now, I understand why they don't want to do that. You don't want to be the judge that says Palestine is a state, Palestine's not a state, right? You're going to get hate mail for the rest of your life or worse. So, in a sense, this was an easy out for them. But the easy out is not a legal conclusion. last week, the International Court of Justice had this advisory opinion, which many people will have heard of. It was not a decision of a case. There's no case. It was like a answer to a question from the General Assembly.
Everyone can make a query?
UN bodies, let's say.
So there's a lot of them? There's a lot of queries on the footstep of
There's a few.
doorstep of...
No, there's not a lot.
How come?
Because they don't really care about many things. But this is the second one about Israel and Yehuda v'Shimon. But it is in much of the reporting, you would think that the ICC concluded that Israel is occupying the West Bank.
That's the general assumption that I got.
Never happened. The question from the General Assembly already was, Israel is occupying the West Bank and being very terrible to the Palestinians and occupying Palestinian territory.
That's not the question.
No, wait, the question. So what then should happen to Israel because of its illegal occupation of Palestinian territory? So then I said, well, if they're doing this illegal thing, they should stop doing it and pay them back. But they did not ever consider whether it was or was not legal, because that was already baked into the question. So nonsense in, nonsense out. There was no independent finding. But from the ICJ, that's less surprising because it's itself a branch of the United Nations.
There's a difference between the ICJ and the ICC, and many people are confusing the two.
The ICJ is just an organ of the United Nations. The judges are picked by the UN, like by the General Assembly. So you should expect conclusions that reflect the median voter on the United Nations General Assembly, and that's about what we got. The ICC is supposed to be better, more independent.
Who picks the judges in the ICC?
The country, there's an assembly of the countries that are members.
So that's political as well.
It is in fact political, yes, but it's a different configuration of countries, a little bit better than the General Assembly.
Only because the countries that are more dictatorship-like do not want to sign the treaty because they would be indicted as well?
Fewer of them. A bunch of African countries have signed and been prosecuted, and now, so part of the problem with the ICC, basically there's, the majority of their membership is either European countries, which are unlikely to ever be in conflict situations.
Let's see. I think the future is going to be bleaker than you think.
Okay. Which have thus far not been in significant conflict situations. And African and Latin American countries. Now, the African countries turn out to be quite often in conflicts, in particular civil wars, some of them quite horrible. And as a result, pretty much all of the ICC's actual prosecutions to date have been of Africans. Now, this has led the African Union to threaten to walk out, to all quit the ICC altogether. That would destroy, of course...
Wait, I misunderstood. Why would the African Union threaten to leave the ICC?
I mean, the African Union on behalf of the member countries.
I understand.
Because they don't like being prosecuted for these crimes. That's not what they signed up for. So then the question is, what did they... So now that puts the ICC in a predicament. They can't do any more Africa cases because they're afraid countries will quit, and some countries already started quitting. That's very bad for the ICC.
And we're talking about a year where in Central Africa, the Central Republic of Africa, millions of people... Congo and other countries... I think right now, since the beginning of this year, we have horrible conflicts in Ethiopia, in Central Africa, in East Africa, in many countries, actually.
Yes, civil wars, conflicts of every kind. In general, the worst wars of the 21st century so far have been what was called the Great Congo War, the Great African
3 million
War.
people were killed according to the
Nobody knows at this point. Some millions of people. So why did these African countries join is the question. And part of the reason is the European Union pays them to.
Is this is this something that you say and you can prove? Or?
Yeah, for sure. Well, okay. I can say what I mean. The European Union likes the ICC. That is to say, it's an official policy. Mm-hmm. They have a policy saying, we love the ICC. And it is part of... we seek to secure more and more countries' membership in the ICC as part of our foreign policy. It is a top-level foreign policy objective for us to get as many countries to join as possible. So, when we are considering our relations with other countries, which in the case of African countries will be, for example, aid, whether they are not members of the ICC will be a central criteria. So you will get aid It's a factor in the aid equation, a big factor. So that encourages countries to join.
Okay, so for instance, countries like Belarus with Lukashenko, are they like a potential candidate for a trial in the ICC?
The argument would have to be that they did things that on the territory of Ukraine, which is accepted ICC jurisdiction. But they themselves have not. But Russia, for example, has not joined, but is being invested.
Israel is also not a country... okay. You mentioned that because of Palestine is supposedly is a country.
And also, so they made up this country of Palestine. And also, if there's a country of Palestine, who knows what its borders are? So, but the ICC has not only created a country, they also have claimed to determine its borders, which is very difficult because how does ICC jurisdiction work? The idea is a country has jurisdiction within its own territory, and it can delegate that jurisdiction. If it doesn't have jurisdiction for whatever reason, it cannot delegate. So, for example, if there's a status of forces agreement, status of forces agreement is like an agreement that governs the presence of foreign troops. So, for example, America has many such agreements with
countries like Japan, Korea, many countries.
Yeah, wherever America...
So many countries.
Providing often for American jurisdiction over the trial of certain crimes by American service members. So, those American service members in countries that have signed for the ICC are not going to be subject to ICC jurisdiction. Why? Because the country itself does not have jurisdiction over them. So then let's go back to Israel. Under the Oslo Accords, one of the clear provisions of the Oslo Accords is that Israel has jurisdiction over all Israeli civilians in the
anywhere
West Bank.
in between the two banks of from the river to the sea.
So it has criminal jurisdiction over them.
Only Israeli citizens.
Yes. So that means even if there was the state of Palestine, it would not have jurisdiction to delegate.
According to Israeli law. But if there is...
according to the Oslo Accords.
According to the Oslo Accords between the PLO and Israel and the Israeli law because they're still Israeli citizens.
Yes, but more importantly, according to the Oslo Accords, which the Palestinians signed. But more fundamentally, these are all sort of technical arguments. Right? The shocking thing is the principal crime, right, of starvation is being charged despite Israel providing more food per person into the conflicted territory than I think has gone into any conflicted territory during war, ever. That is to say, if this is called starvation, everything is starvation. Right? That is to say, it is always the case that war, especially urban war, disrupts food supplies, disrupts people's lives, disrupts distribution. Right? That's certainly the case. Right? In Iraq and Afghanistan, many tens of thousands of people are said to have died from incidental causes. That does not make it an action attributable to...
Can the court use the claims of high-ranking officials in the Israeli government saying that they want to impose an occupation on Gaza or the West Bank as some kind of a legal statement?
So I don't know the claims you're talking about. There were several statements by Israeli officials that were used heavily in the ICC proceedings. In particular, statements like, we are imposing a siege. Nothing is going in. But that itself is not a statement of an intent to starve the civilian population. It's a statement of an announcement of a siege, which is entirely lawful. Similarly, other strong statements by Israeli officials, you have to look at in relation to, is there an etiquette book for the kind of things leaders of countries can say after a major attack? I didn't bring the list with me, but the interested listener can find on Twitter. I had a long list of statements by various Western officials in various conflicts. I think I remember Admiral Hawley, prominent U.S. admiral in the Pacific, said in World War II, "When we are done, the only place Japanese will be spoken is in the history books." Or President Obama speaking during the campaign on ISIS. Right? These are savage people that we're going to wipe out. Or Biden, at that time a U.S. senator, during the campaign on Serbia, saying, no method is ruled out in our fight. We can do any method we want. So all sorts of shocking statements that you would think, because there's no rule of etiquette for the kind of things you can say. In fact, it's clear that there has not been any intention to starve, because food has always been supplied. And if you really wanted to starve people, you could actually bomb food supplies affirmatively, which has never been done. There is, of course, a massive military interest in denying aid to Hamas to force them out of the tunnels. And that is a legitimate war aim. Now, if Hamas chooses to take the food that is coming in for itself, or burn it, or destroy it, or not distribute it, that is entirely their responsibility, not Israel's.
Is there anything that you can think about? Now I'm asking you to be the devil's advocate. I'm using air quotes. Is there anything that Israel does in the West Bank that is applicable by the ICC? Or because the specific situation you mentioned, nothing is applicable?
No, the ICC has simply no jurisdiction whatsoever. Now, that does not mean that if Israeli soldiers on an individual level commit crimes, destroying private property or things like this, that they shouldn't be prosecuted by
who?
Israeli officials.
But if Israel elects not to do it, theoretically, if Israel elects not to do it, and the international law says, listen, there's this or that claim, you did not investigate it.
There is no tribunal for it, which is not unusual. Again, that is the case 99% of the time.
So if, in that case, if the international law would call or subpoena those generals or even those simple soldiers, I'm translating from Hebrew, the phrase simple soldier is not something that is outside of Hebrew, but in that case, you still need to address it. You can't just say, this is illegal, I'm not even playing this game. Right? Or you can.
What do you mean? Who needs to address what?
The Israeli government. Because I saw that eventually Aaron Barak was sent to dispute the message. The Israeli government...
So that's the ICJ. That was a different case.
Okay, but in the case of the ICC...
ICJ is different.
No, I understand about the ICJ because it's part of the UN and Israel is part of the UN.
Also, there's two ICJ cases. There's the advisory opinion from last week and then there's these proceedings...
The South African...
South Africa.
Yeah, but Israel still did everything... as proper. But in the case of the ICC, Israel is just going to ignore it?
We should ignore it because So with the ICJ, the reason we sent Aaron Barak, and now a different judge, a different jurist, is because we have in fact agreed to the ICJ's jurisdiction. They're misusing it, they're abusing it, they're interpreting it incorrectly, but...
It's still part of the UN where we are part.
No, it's not because of the UN. No, it's because we specifically... being a part of the UN does not make you subject to the ICJ jurisdiction. Most countries, you have to specifically agree to the ICJ jurisdiction, either with relation to a particular dispute, or by agreeing to a treaty which says that disputes under that treaty would be decided by the ICJ.
Why did Israel agree to that treaty?
It didn't. Because it's the Genocide Convention. And the Genocide Convention, which we signed in the 1950s, said any disputes under this treaty shall be decided by the ICJ. Now, it was thought that meant disputes like Serbia and Croatia are having a war, they accuse each other of genocide, and the ICJ can decide whether one of them... So South Africa took a very aggressive interpretation. It's not the first time it's happened. It's the second time, I think. They wrote a letter to Israel, and they said...
Stop genociding?
They said, you're committing genocide. And the foreign ministry wrote a very nice letter back... No, explaining why not. No, we don't think we are.
Is there any formal definition of a genocide that we can rely on?
Yeah, there's a definition in the Genocide Convention, but it's quite broad. But listen, this is the dispute. So South Africa writes a letter saying, you're committing genocide. Israel writes back, no, we're not. And then South Africa takes these two letters and goes to the ICJ. Look, we have a dispute with Israel about the interpretation of the Genocide Convention. Now, I don't think that's what the Genocide Convention means. And by the way, many countries, like America, nice countries, did not agree to ICJ jurisdiction over genocide because they said they'll find some way to abuse it. They will find some way to basically assert jurisdiction over all of our wars. Israel took a different view. Of course, it's the Genocide Convention. Who could be against the Genocide Convention?
Once you signed it, like we did in the 1950s, can you unsign it?
Yes, and we should. We absolutely should. And not only that, we should unsign every treaty where we have agreed to mandatory ICJ jurisdiction, or at least begin to seriously review them, because this can be done over and over. And we should not think that this is the last time it's going to happen. Indeed, from now on, anytime we have a war, all it takes is some country in the world
to send an email,
South Africa, to create a situation in which these judges in The Hague, picked by the General Assembly, the president is a Lebanese politician, will have micromanagement over Israeli military operations. And maybe so far it hasn't been so bad, but is this a world that we can live with? And is there anything good about it? And nor is there anything bad about not accepting ICJ jurisdiction under Genocide Convention. It doesn't make you a genocidal state, right? America, a bunch of other countries, 30-some countries did not accept this jurisdiction. And we need to fix this. But that is to say, I see the South African case as kind of a legal October 7th. That is to say, we should have seen it coming. Like, it was off, the ground was prepared, there was an opening, and we just thought it wouldn't happen, right? With the chutzpah, right? How would they do it? So they had the chutzpah.
But unlike the October 7th attack and the war that pursue, just leaving the treaties will just cause the majority of the world just to say, okay, on the head of the thief.
Okay. So I'm not sure about that. First of all, leaving the treaties is a news story for one day, right? Whereas,
like everything in this time and age.
Except for the ICJ proceedings, which is every 2 months, they have a hearing, they issue a new order, right? If the idea is to say, we don't want people to say that we're committing genocide, being part of this ICJ treaty does not seem to be very effective at getting there. But moreover, what I would actually do is I would quit the treaties, and several countries have done this, and then
Which ones?
I can send you a list.
No, but it's like normal countries or one of the dictatorships.
It depends a bit of both. Just depends on the situation. Look, most normal countries have good legal departments which tell them not to agree to the ICJ jurisdiction. America saw in advance.
Just in case that you're thinking about now the natural listener saying, what, countries leaving treaties? So, for instance, Lithuania just last week left a treaty related to the usage of פצצות מצרר. I don't know the name of it in English.
Countries leave treaties all the time.
Yeah, so it's something that happens.
I would say, for example, America has been taken to The Hague under various treaties that it has agreed to ICJ jurisdiction, and it has, time after time, quit those treaties as a response to being taken to The Hague. That's America's standard reaction. So Israel's being a bit of a friar by not doing that. But what one can do is one can quit the treaty. So some of these treaties we don't want to not be part of. We just don't want to agree to the ICJ provision. It's called, which, again, in America, that's a standard thing. America will not sign a treaty without saying we do not agree to the ICJ provision.
Yeah, but we live in a world where diplomacy is so important, and if countries, especially the European Union, would want to build a case to start establishing sanctions against Israel?
No? Because we can quit the treaty and join 10 seconds later. Okay, it's a technical thing. There's what's called a reservation. When you join a treaty, you can say, we're joining except for whatever provisions you want to opt out of. Once you've signed the treaty, you can't make a reservation. So if at that point you want to opt out of a certain provision, what countries do is they quit the treaty
and re-sign it with the provisions.
And re-sign it with the provisions. So we would still be members of the Genocide Convention or whatever other more obscure treaty. But certainly being members of the Genocide Convention, let's put it this way, how well is that working out for us for not being condemned for genocide?
I don't know, because I'm not living in the reality where we're not part of it. I don't know if it was the legal grounds or the moral grounds or just to start the movement against Israel on a sanction level.
It's happening anyway. We would for sure join it, but no one has to submit to the ICJ jurisdiction. We're just silly enough to have done it.
So in your opinion, Israel should just negate all of the claims?
What do you mean? Just
not to respond to them even?
No. I'm not saying that because in this case we have agreed to the ICJ. I'm saying going forward, do we want, when we fight in Lebanon, for this Lebanese judge to be judging whether we're committing genocide in Lebanon? Do we want every single conflict to be subject to this political maneuver?
Can we use those jurisdictions or just any of these treaties to help us with the situation in Lebanon, for instance?
No, not really, because first of all, the majority of the court will never be on our side.
Can we at least use it to show their hypocrisy?
It doesn't get you far.
Did we try?
I think there's better ways of showing hypocrisy. And typically, people are not interested in claims of hypocrisy because they say, you know what, okay, maybe the other guys are bad, but at least we're going to get you. That's so. For example, on the genocide, the great irony of the genocide case is that claims have not been brought against Iran, which actively and clearly has attempted and promoted and called for genocide. Now, Iran has not agreed to ICJ jurisdiction under this, I believe, but nonetheless, if they're responsible for acts in Palestine, surely the ICC should be indicting them. I think that's another major weakness of the ICC case. They have this facial, they did this game of reciprocity. We're doing Israel and Hamas. But it's not Israel.
And Netanyahu.
Right. It's not Israel and Hamas. It's Israel and Iran. So going after the minor throwaway local militia is actually a cop-out.
I tend to agree. Let's do a few questions.
From the listeners.
Yeah, from the listeners. Sorry, listeners, I'm going to jump over a few questions which are complete troll questions which you won't even address, so I'm not even saying them. Which 3 reforms you think are the most critical to change in the legal system in Israel, and why?
Let's stick to international law.
Okay, I tried. What's the meaning of the decision in Hague regarding the occupation? Can we just say it didn't happen?
So first of all, it didn't happen. It didn't happen in a couple ways. First of all, it's not a decision of a case. As I mentioned, it's an advisory opinion. By its own, under the ICJ's rules, any decision of the ICJ does not have any authority beyond the parties to the case. Why? Because, again, countries can only be bound by their consent. So if 2 countries agree to have their dispute heard by the ICJ, it can't affect a third country. But in this case, not only did we not agree, there's no case, there's no dispute between countries, and it's not legally binding, but also they did not make any findings about occupation. Right? They simply repeated what the General Assembly had told them. So it actually doesn't, I would call it, it's kind of like, how people like to remake movies that were made 20, 30 years ago? Mm-hmm. It's like the reboot of the 2004 advisory opinion on the wall, right? But like bigger, fancier, slicker. They just like put in more special effects. But just like that opinion ultimately was ignored and forgotten.
Just in case you're not following and you don't know exactly what he refers to, in 2005, the International Court declared that the wall itself, which was supposedly an act from the left side in Israel.
Which they said in occupied Palestinian territory, they called it.
Yeah, because the wall itself was built on an occupied land or an occupied territory, it's illegal, despite the fact that the people on the left would claim this is a border, which is good if you want 2 states. But the international law declared it's not good.
The International Court of Justice, not international law.
Yeah, of course.
In an advisory opinion. So, I think we can learn a lot from that. 20 years later, it's barely remembered. And, that should be also the way we react to this. Ultimately, how it's used depends more on, geopolitical developments than anything in the advisory opinion.
Some of the questions refer to the case for a strong judicial system in Israel that is supposed to protect Israel against claims from the international community. People are asking for you to pass your judgment or pass your opinion.
So I don't think anything that happens in the domestically in the Israeli legal system is going to affect in any way whether or not we are subject to these international proceedings, because the standards for what the ICC, for example, looks for in a legal system to determine that it is adequate and not prosecute are so low that surely even the greatest critics of judicial reform would understand that even in its most maximal version, Israel would have a more functioning legal system than Guyana, African Guyana. Why do I pick Guyana? Guinea. Because Guinea was a country where the ICC wanted to bring some proceedings, but then they said, oh, you know what? They look like they have a legal system, and they say they're going to deal with it, so that's enough. So the standard for what constitutes a working legal system for the ICC is very low, but also, more importantly, the way they have reframed the question is not, it doesn't matter what kind of legal system we have. Unless the Israeli prosecutors believe and that the crimes that the ICC believes have happened and are investigating them, they're still going to bring their proceedings. In other words, unless the Israeli leadership is going to be prosecuted for starvation, they're going to say, you're not doing your job. Doesn't matter how well the legal system works.
Okay, let's refer now, if you don't mind, still in the international law side of things. We see now cases where the U.S. Department of Justice is putting limitations, sanctions on Israeli civilians because of things that they are doing that are against some kind of international law. So if you can just explain the situation, what Israel can do against it if it chooses to.
Okay. So this is quite unprecedented. In February, the Biden administration announced an executive order which would allow them to sanction what they call people who do bad things in the West Bank. Now, what's called a bad thing? So there's
that was the phrasing?
No, I'm describing it generally.
Okay.
Because there's two kinds of bad things. One kind of bad thing is acts of violence. Now, everyone would agree that acts of violence is bad, but they take a very broad definition of acts of violence, including property crime, intimidation, that is to say, well short of physical violence.
Short of?
Yes. Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
Why there's a separation between defecation in somebody's property, as I saw in a clip, or physical violence? Physical violence isn't worse?
No, it's worse. I'm saying short of things that are not as bad as.
Yeah, I understand. So why did they put the market?
They include that. They include
anything short of. Okay.
Intimidation, property crimes, etc. Now, when we say crimes, hold off as to what we mean by crime, that's one thing. A second thing is anything that is bad for peace, security, or stability in the West Bank. Now, what is bad for peace, security, and stability in the West Bank? According to the Biden administration, Jews living in the West Bank is bad for peace, security, and stability in the West Bank.
That's something that you guess, or this is something that is written down clearly?
It is something that the Biden administration have said settlements are an obstacle to peace. The executive order allows sanctions on things that are bad for peace. Jews praying at Rachaba, obstacle to peace. There's quotes from the Biden administration saying so. So all of those things can be potentially sanctioned. In other words, the sanctions order actually gives the administration power, or claims power, to sanction anybody. And the sanctions mean bank account freezes, travel bans, who simply disagrees and acts against the administration's foreign policy. In other words, they're doing what, for so long, Israel had been threatened and warned not to do. Interfering with civil society. And we have examples now. Tzavteisha is a protest organization.
Yeah, but Tzavteisha wasn't in the West Bank. Tzavteisha was in Israel, right?
They sanctioned it anyway. There was just
it's not under the supervision of that executive order.
It doesn't have to be in the West Bank. It has to undermine peace and stability. So they say, you know what, undermines peace and stability. They pointed to one incident where there was a truck that was attacked.
I saw the clip.
Which Tzavteisha said, by the way, they had nothing to do with, and a different organization claimed responsibility for. What does Tzavteisha do? They lie down in front of trucks, which is an ordinary form of protest in Israel, right? In the judicial reform protests, in America, in the Black Lives Matter protests, in the current pro-Hamas protests. They've closed many airports this way. They lie down and block traffic. That's what Tzav 9 does. And they do it as a form of protest. And they have been sanctioned because the administration disagrees with them. Another major Israeli organization, Regevim, is being discussed as an object of sanctions, both in the UK and the US.
Is that something that someone... Let's say they indict Smotrich. Can Smotrich
It's not indict.
enforce sanctions upon, okay? So if they enforce sanctions upon a high-ranking official like Smotrich, can Smotrich appeal to the Supreme Court in the United States?
No, this is not Israel. You can't just, there's no such thing as just bringing a bagatz. You can't go to you have to engage in an administrative procedure, which is very difficult and can take many years. And in the meantime, you can't get money from your bank account. Many years before you can go to court. Then you start with the lower court and you get to the Supreme Court 10 years later.
So the answer is no. Israel does not have anything to do against it.
No, wait, hold on. Now, also some people have been sanctioned for violence.
Elor Azaria, for instance.
That's an unusual example because he was a soldier and that was a clear incident.
And the sanction is just a black rubber band on his ability to enter the United States, which is quite normal.
And his family.
The family part is different.
It's extremely abnormal because he was, in fact, tried, prosecuted. That's an example, right? This was before any kind of judicial reform.
Wait. I just want to say that when you apply for a visa for the United States, one of the questions is, were you ever convicted on a crime? And even if you say, yeah, I was convicted, I served time in jail because I did this or that, they can still put a black stamp on your
How many
visa.
Palestinians convicted of terrorism have they?
I don't know.
Zero.
Zero?
Yeah. So we're going to get back to that in a second. When you look at what the so-called violent settlers have been sanctioned for, I don't know whether they're violent or not. I don't know. But I can tell you from reading the reports that the State Department has put out, absolutely impossible to tell. That is to say, no specifics, no details. Just say, has been involved in violence towards Palestinian villages. No, show me when. Maybe it was self-defense. So another thing we know is that where do they get their data on settler violence from? They get it from the United Nations, from an office called OSHA, the Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs. Where does OSHA get its data from?
Organizations in the West Bank, of course.
Organizations. Now, journalists have looked at the OSHA data. OSHA counts as settler violence any incident in which a Palestinian gets hurt, including, for example, some people break into a guy's farm with knives and get shot. Settler violence. Soldiers kill a terrorist in an operation. Settler violence. So what this means is a Jew living in Judea and Samaria who is attacked, if he doesn't defend himself, he's in trouble. And if he defends himself, he may be sanctioned by the United States.
That's exactly what they're saying. They're saying they don't want Jews to live in Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, and they are using the kind of sanctions typically reserved for terrorist organizations. That used to be on the sanctions they had on the Houthis are now on...
Yeah, that's what I wanted to add, and I'm happy that I didn't circumvent you, but these kind of sanctions are prevalent, but only with terrorists, drug dealers, criminals, etc. So it's not unprecedented.
It is unprecedented to have
be used on...
For example, for many of the settler sanctions, the so-called violent settlers, it's quite clear. Again, I said it's not clear what the specific incident is, but the general allegation seems to be property crime. Right? They're accused of scaring off sheep or things like this. I don't know of any sanctions for sheep crimes.
Yeah, so in parallel, people like Russian oligarchs.
Money laundering for Putin and arms trafficking and things like this.
Yeah, but that's something that we do see.
Yes.
Yeah, we do see sanctions on Russian oligarchs.
What's interesting is these sanctions, the order says, we're concerned about peace and stability in the West Bank, and so we're going to sanction people who do violent things in the West Bank. So since, there are every month countless Palestinian terrorist attacks, dozens of what I would call major attacks and hundreds of minor attacks, including arson, property crimes, and so forth. How many of those people have been sanctioned? Zero. Right? Indeed, the Palestinian government has a program called Pay for Slay, which the United States Congress passed a law about, saying it promotes terrorism. So you would think that every member of the Palestinian government involved in Pay for Slay, Abbas, etc., is grossly undermining peace in the West Bank by having a program that pays for terrorism.
Yeah, but one would say that in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, there's the IDF, and the IDF is aggressive against, you can say it's not aggressive enough, but the IDF is aggressive against Arab terrorists, and there's hundreds of casualties in the last year and a half.
But they're not aggressive against the government of the Palestinian Authority for Pefusle,
No.
and nobody has been sanctioned.
But they are aggressive against people that are acting violently. You can say it's not aggressive enough, but they are aggressive. A lot of people are there.
For example, there was a gentleman, I forget his name, who committed an act of terror. It was about 2 months, past month. And before Tzahal could get him, he walked into a Palestinian police station and said, "Arrest me." And they did. And they arrested him and they put him in jail. And
It's common practice.
Tzahal couldn't get him.
Yeah.
And then they released him. So...
Yeah, we shouldn't be surprised because
but the point,
a big part of the Palestinian budget goes to the families of terrorists.
So this is sanctions, which even though it doesn't say so, in practice, they're sanctions against Jews.
Yeah, it is. That's exactly that.
Even though it doesn't say it. No, by the way, if it is actually that, it's clearly unconstitutional.
Of course, but
So that's a major problem.
Of course, but we understand that it is what it is.
Yeah.
They're trying to force Israel out of the West Bank.
Yes.
And
for free.
I don't know what for free, but
that's to say, without even a negotiated settlement. Yes, they're trying to make it impossible for Jews to defend themselves, but most scarily, they're actually punishing. Right? I mean, let me put it this way. Let's say Prime Minister Netanyahu froze the bank accounts of groups that protested him. What would we say? Putin, okay, yeah. Erdogan, but that is exactly what is happening. That is, the U.S. government is freezing bank accounts of Israelis, sometimes who are American citizens, by the way, who don't agree with them.
I gotta say that if they're American citizens, it's much better in my eyes, because then they have jurisdiction. Then they can say, yeah, it's something that we disapprove of, and then it's our citizen.
But American citizens also have constitutional rights, so it's actually worse.
In that case, they can appeal?
In that case, they could sue, yes. And I would not be surprised if there are lawsuits filed in the near future.
And they have a chance?
I think so.
Okay. Let's continue. Do like one or two more questions.
Yeah,
and
I do have to go soon.
Yeah, I know. Let's do the last one, okay? Mm-hmm. Ariel Karlinsky is asking, on Russ Roberts, which was a fabulous episode, you should listen to it, everyone. Eugene explained very well about the status of Judea and Sumeria, and why, I'm translating from Hebrew as I go, and why his stance is it's not an occupied territory. What do you think about the status of the people in Judea and Sumeria? Can the state of Israel just decide that from now on, people in specific cities are not citizens, for instance, inside of Israel?
Bnei Brak, I read this.
Yeah. What's the difference between the status that Israel imposed on the Golan Heights compared to Judea and Sumeria? And that's the last one.
That's two questions.
Yeah. I slipped one in it.
So what's the status? So it depends on the status of what people. Right? Status is based on citizenship. And generally taking away citizenship is much harder than granting it. Right? That is to say, it's much harder to take away citizenship of people who have it than...
Granting citizenship?
Yes. That is.
Why that's because of the law in Israel?
No. In general, there's no requirement to give people citizenship. But once people have citizenship...
Wait, in Israel you have the Chok HaShvut, which declares like the right of a Jew to be citizen of Israel, right?
No, I'm saying independent of national... As a matter of international...
Oh, okay.
Right. De-citizening people is harder than... Is not harder, is, what do you call it? More regulated than citizening them. Mm-hmm. So there are non-Israeli citizens living in Yehuda v'Shomron, and it's not unusual to have a country with foreign citizens living in it. Now, it's important to point out, so I'm from America, as you can tell. In America, we had a motto, no taxation without representation. So that's a basic principle, maybe not an international law principle, it's a political philosophy principle.
Yeah, you can see those signs in Washington where there is a taxation without representation.
So in Washington, there is taxation. In Yehuda v'Shomron, of the Palestinians, there is not taxation without representation. They don't pay taxes in Israel. They're not drafted by Israel. Israel does not, design their educational systems, their pension systems. The only regulation Israel has...
Borders.
Of this borders is not a regulation. Borders is a political fact. Is security, right? Israel's principal regulation is a security regulation. And that actually doesn't really matter whether they're citizens, not citizens, whether if there was a Palestinian state, for example, and they were all citizens of a Palestinian state, Israel could still take measures to defend itself because self-defense is an inherent right. Right, so for example, people in Afghanistan are not American citizens, but America still for 20 years carried out operations there when it thought necessary. So Israel does not regulate them. They are in fact regulated by the Palestinian Authority. And, Oslo really happened and it really changed things. And I think a lot of people forget that Oslo, want to pretend that Oslo didn't happen. Oslo might not have given the Palestinians a state, but it certainly gave them a government which regulates them and controls their lives for all purposes other than their ability to hurt Israelis.
So I have to ask, because I know you're in a hurry, I'll try to be quick, but if, for instance, we'll do an annexation, like we've done with the Golan Heights, what's the difference between an apartheid state and a state, and a situation where Israel annexed the Judean Sumerian territory, and these people does not have the right to vote?
So, first of all, I wouldn't call it annexation. Annexation because you can't annex something that you already have a legal claim to.
But right now, Israel decided not to have a full legal occupation of the Judean Sumerian.
Did not decide to fully exercise its sovereignty.
Yeah.
So, I can tell you that I believe that the basic requirement. So first of all, I don't think this is a realistic scenario because it's not something that's practically being politically discussed. That is to say, even under the Trump administration, what was being discussed is applying Israeli law to those parts primarily where Israelis live.
See.
Right. So let's say see. Now, of course, the Palestinians want to say, no, if you take any of it, you have to take all of it. But who says, right, that there's absolutely no such imperative. Just like we don't have to take Gaza as well, right? If we take Yehuda v'Shomron, even though they say it's part of one thing, in fact, historically, it has not been. So, first of all, I believe that if there was a partial application of Israeli law to Area C, it would be a good idea to offer Israeli citizenship to the Arabs living there. I think it would be very unlikely that most of them would take it, based on past precedents. And based on the incentives that they face, and in fact, Israel does not want to govern this population, so they're using apartheid as a threat, right? As a weapon. They can say, "We're going to make you apartheid us
by not accepting the citizenship offer."
No. If they don't accept it, then that's their own personal decision. By making you take the entire
yeah.
So, but you can't make someone apartheid. Someone else. That is to say, there's absolutely nothing that mandates us to accept their formulation of the territorial situation. So in a sense, it's another way. It's an attempt to weaponize Palestinian suffering, but we don't have to accept that formulation. And I think it would be unwise to do so. At the same time, I'll tell you, there's places like American Samoa. Where the people in American Samoa are nationals of the United States, but not citizens. Which means...
Isn't that the situation in Puerto Rico?
No, they are citizens, they just don't vote.
Okay.
But the difference there is it's territorial. So they don't vote if they're in Puerto Rico, or they don't vote for president. But if they come to New York, for example, as many Puerto Ricans do, then they can vote. American Samoans, it's a personal status. They are nationals, not citizens. So even if they come to America, they cannot vote. It is completely subject to Congress in ways that, go far beyond any regulation of Judea and Samaria. That is to say, they have autonomy, but Congress can override that anytime if it sees fit. Is it apartheid? I don't know. It's not generally referred to as apartheid. As a matter of fact, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, in a case maybe 5 years ago, upheld this arrangement against a challenge under the Equal Protection Clause.
Okay, I don't want to keep you any longer.
Yes, thank you.
Also 10 p.m. Thank you very, very much for your time, and I hope we can do it again, and then we can dive into more subject. Again, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.